"The last load is the one that changes everything," the old truck driver said, as he climbed down from the cab, wiping the East Texas dust from his hands before looking across the weathered barn that had stood outside Nacogdoches longer than most people in the county could remember. It was a warm Tuesday morning in June of 2007, and another trailer backed slowly toward the fence line with the same familiar sound of gravel crunching beneath heavy tires. The load behind it was nothing anyone wanted: thousands of pounds of scrap leather, trimmed edges, irregular cuts, rejected panels, and misshapen pieces left behind after the tannery finished making expensive hides for boot companies, saddle makers, and upholstery suppliers across Texas. For nearly a decade those leftovers had arrived at exactly the same place, unloaded in exactly the same corner of the property, while nearly everyone in the business assumed they were watching an old woman collect something with no future. The tannery accountant considered it cheaper than paying landfill fees. The production manager called it a convenient arrangement. The truck drivers joked that they were delivering tomorrow's fire hazard instead of yesterday's waste. Nobody laughed harder than the workers, who watched Ariel Batiste wave them toward the same growing stacks year after year. She never argued. She never explained herself. She only pointed toward the next empty space beside the barn and thanked them for bringing another shipment. By the summer of 2007, the piles had become impossible to ignore. They filled sheds, old grain bins, covered racks, and carefully built storage rooms that hadn't existed when the deliveries first began. Every bundle carried handwritten tags. Every color had its own section. Every thickness rested on separate shelves. Nothing looked random, although nobody outside the property understood the system. The driver glanced at the mountain of sorted leather one final time, before handing Ariel the delivery receipt. "Plant's shutting this program down," he said. "This is the last free load you will ever get." Ariel studied the stacks without the slightest sign of disappointment. She folded the receipt, slipped it into the pocket of her faded work shirt, and answered with only 2 quiet words. "Good," she said. "Enough." The driver frowned because he thought she meant enough waste. She meant something entirely different. She had spent 9 years waiting for this exact morning, and the reason would soon force an entire industry to look at those forgotten piles in a way it never had before. Long before anyone questioned where those shipments were going, the leather industry across East Texas had already decided what belonged in the finished product and what did not. This was not a disagreement. It was simply the way the business worked. Every hide that entered a commercial tannery followed the same path through soaking, liming, tanning, drying, grading, and cutting until only the sections that met strict commercial standards continued toward manufacturers. Boot companies demanded consistent grain. Saddle makers required large uninterrupted panels. Furniture suppliers wanted broad surfaces without natural defects or irregular edges. Anything that failed to match those specifications disappeared from the production line before customers ever knew it had existed. The interesting part was that very little of that discarded material was actually damaged. Most of it had simply become too small, too narrow, too curved, or too irregular for high-volume manufacturing. A leather side might lose nearly 1/3 of its usable area before reaching the shipping department. Not because the fibers were weak, but because modern factories were designed for efficiency, rather than flexibility. Every additional minute spent sorting unusual pieces cost more than producing another standardized panel. The economics were simple enough that almost nobody bothered asking whether those leftover sections still possessed value. They measured productivity by finished square feet leaving the loading dock, not by the quality of everything left behind. Disposal became another line in the operating budget, calculated alongside electricity, chemicals, transportation, and labor. Managers looked at monthly reports, approved hauling invoices, and moved on to the next production cycle. That routine repeated year after year, until it became invisible to everyone inside the industry. Around Nacogdoches, trucks carried premium hides toward manufacturers, while separate trailers quietly transported everything else away without attracting attention from any outside the business. Farmers passed those trucks every day, without giving them a second glance. Ranchers worried about rainfall, cattle prices, and hay yields instead of manufacturing waste streams. The county accepted the arrangement because it had always existed. It was gravity. Nobody considered that the overlooked material leaving those facilities represented thousands of pounds of carefully processed natural fiber whose structure had already survived one of the most expensive manufacturing processes in agriculture. Almost nobody, because somewhere beyond the pine trees and county roads, one woman had been studying those shipments with a level of attention that no production manager, accountant, or factory owner had ever imagined necessary. And over the years she quietly began seeing patterns that everyone else had mistaken for leftovers. Ariel Batiste was 52 years old in the summer of 2007, and she had lived on the same 68 acres outside Nacogdoches since the day she married Leon Batiste nearly 3 decades earlier. The property had never been one of the largest farms in Cherokee County, and it had never produced the kind of income that attracted attention at county meetings or livestock auctions. The pasture was modest, the equipment was old, and every improvement on the land had been made one careful season at a time instead of through borrowed money. Let me tell you about Ariel, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand the decision that puzzled an entire industry. She was the granddaughter of Elijah Batiste, a craftsman from eastern Louisiana, who had spent most of his working life repairing harnesses, wagon traces, and mule collars for small farms before moving his family west after the Second World War. Elijah believed that every material revealed its purpose only after someone learned how it failed. He would stretch it, fold it, wet it, dry it, cut it, and examine every layer before deciding what it could become. Ariel's father, Roland Batiste, inherited that habit instead of the business itself. He built custom tack for ranchers across East Texas, not because it made him wealthy, but because he believed that careful workmanship outlasted changing markets. As a young girl, Ariel spent countless afternoons beside his workbench handing him stitching awls, edge bevelers, burnishing tools, and stitching thread while he explained why one section bent smoothly, another resisted tension, and another would last for decades if used correctly. He rarely spoke about profit. He spoke about structure. He often told her that people judged a material by its appearance long before they understood its character. Those lessons settled quietly into her way of thinking. Years later, when most people saw discarded remnants, Ariel noticed grain direction, fiber density, flexibility, and durability instead. She had developed the unusual habit of examining every piece individually before deciding where it belonged. Almost the same way her father had once studied every hide laid across his wooden bench. She did not believe that value disappeared simply because a factory no longer had a use for something. She believed that value waited for someone patient enough to recognize it. That belief would soon explain why every shelf, rack, crate, and storage room on her property had been organized with extraordinary precision, long before anyone else realized they were looking at something far more important than leftovers. Let me tell you about the people who believed they understood the business better than Ariel, because they were the reason her quiet routine remained invisible for so many years. The largest tannery within driving distance of her property was managed by Victor Langston, a production superintendent who had spent 26 years measuring success in output reports, shipping schedules, and operating costs. Victor was not an unreasonable man. He was an efficient man. He believed every process should move forward without interruption, Every storage area should remain clear, and every expense should be reduced whenever possible. If a material no longer served the production line, then removing it quickly became part of producing quality products. That philosophy guided nearly every decision inside the facility. The accounting office saw disposal as a predictable operating expense. The environmental contractor calculated transportation by weight. The warehouse supervisor focused on creating floor space for incoming inventory, instead of preserving pieces that no customer had requested. Everyone involved solved a different problem, yet all of them reached exactly the same conclusion, without ever discussing it together. The material leaving the plant represented cost, rather than opportunity. Around East Texas, other manufacturers followed nearly identical practices, because they competed on speed, consistency, and volume instead of flexibility. Custom craftsmanship belonged to another generation. Large production contracts demanded standardized dimensions that automated cutting tables could process quickly. Anything outside those dimensions slowed production, and slowing production meant losing money. That was the gravity of the industry. Nobody questioned it, because the system continued producing profitable results year after year. Ariel never challenged anyone during those conversations. She never tried convincing factory managers that they were overlooking something important. She accepted every delivery with the same calm expression, signed every receipt, and returned to her work without offering explanations. That silence encouraged an assumption that proved surprisingly durable. People believed she was simply helping local businesses reduce hauling costs, while collecting materials for occasional craft projects around the farm. Some thought she planned to sell everything by the pound one day. Others assumed she had become sentimental, because her father had worked with leather decades earlier. None of those explanations came close to the truth. While the industry concentrated on what it could manufacture most efficiently, Ariel had quietly begun organizing information that no production database contained. She was not collecting leftovers. She was building a catalog of possibilities, one shipment at a time. Waiting for a moment when the market itself would begin asking questions that only her carefully assembled collection could answer. Let me tell you about what Ariel understood, because this is where the story actually begins to separate observation from knowledge. Leather is not a uniform material. It is a network of collagen fibers that formed over the lifetime of an animal. And those fibers behave differently depending on where they came from, how they were processed, and how they are later used. During commercial tanning, the objective is not simply to preserve the hide. The objective is to stabilize those collagen fibers so they resist moisture, temperature changes, stretching, and biological decay, while remaining flexible enough for manufacturing. By the time a finished side leaves the tannery, the most expensive work has already been completed. Chemicals have penetrated the fiber structure. Moisture levels have been carefully controlled. Oils have restored flexibility. Mechanical rollers have compressed the surface. The strongest part of the material remains remarkably durable, even after cutting. What factories removed was usually determined by shape rather than strength. Automated cutting systems searched for efficiency. They arranged patterns to maximize production speed, leaving behind narrow strips, curved edges, and irregular sections that no longer matched large manufacturing templates. Those remaining pieces often retained exactly the same grain structure, tensile strength, and wear resistance as the products customers eventually purchased. Ariel knew this, because she had spent years handling leather one piece at a time, instead of one shipment at a time. She sorted by thickness measured in ounces, by grain consistency, by flexibility, by finish, and by natural color variation. She tested how different pieces accepted stitching, edge finishing, embossing, and burnishing. She discovered that many small workshops needed dimensions completely different from the factories that created the material. Wallet makers searched for compact panels. Watch strap craftsmen preferred narrow sections with tight grain. Knife sheath builders wanted dense fibers near the backbone. Repair specialists often required unusual shapes that larger manufacturers routinely discarded. Every category demanded something different, yet none required an entire hide. The industry had optimized itself to manufacture identical products efficiently. Ariel quietly optimized her collection for people who solved individual problems instead. That distinction appeared insignificant, while raw material remained abundant. As long as manufacturers could purchase fresh inventory without delay, nobody had a reason to search for carefully organized alternatives. But markets do not remain unchanged forever. Supply chains tighten, costs rise, customer preferences evolve. And when those changes finally arrived, the careful records Ariel had maintained for nearly a decade would become far more valuable than anyone who loaded those trailers had ever imagined. The change did not arrive gradually. It arrived in the form of regulations, closures, and a market that suddenly realized how dependent it had become on a supply chain it barely understood. During the second half of 2007, several environmental compliance standards affecting industrial waste handling and chemical processing became significantly more expensive for smaller tanneries across the southern United States. Facilities that had operated comfortably for decades now faced higher disposal costs, stricter reporting requirements, and expensive equipment upgrades that many owners postponed for as long as they could. Some reduced production. Others eliminated product lines that generated excessive offcuts. A few simply closed their doors at nearly the same time. Rising global demand for premium hides pushed manufacturers to maximize every full side that entered their cutting rooms. Computerized nesting software became more aggressive, production schedules became tighter, and inventory managers stopped carrying unusual stock that occupied warehouse space without serving high-volume contracts. The unintended consequence appeared almost immediately. Small American workshops that depended upon specialized dimensions could no longer find them through traditional distributors. Repair businesses searching for matching grain. Saddle makers rebuilding vintage tack. Custom wallet craftsmen. Knife sheath makers and restoration specialists all began hearing the same answer. Those materials were no longer available. The supply had not disappeared because the leather no longer existed. It had disappeared because the system that once produced it had quietly changed direction. Ariel watched these developments without surprise, because she had never organized her collection around factory efficiency. She had organized it around future scarcity. Every handwritten label represented a category that large manufacturers considered inconvenient. Every carefully measured bundle represented a specification too unusual for standardized production, but essential for someone solving a precise problem. While others saw regulations increasing costs and factories reducing inventory, Ariel recognized something entirely different. She saw the exact moment when years of careful preparation would become more valuable than speed. The final truck had not marked the end of an arrangement. It had marked the beginning of a shortage that almost nobody else had seen coming. And within days the first people searching for answers would unknowingly begin driving toward the only place that had spent 9 years preparing for their arrival. The first telephone call arrived less than 2 weeks after the final delivery. And Ariel recognized the change before the caller finished introducing himself. A small leather workshop outside Fort Worth was searching for dark brown vegetable tanned material in narrow widths that could no longer be ordered through its regular distributor. Ariel walked into one of her storage buildings without hesitation, counted 3 bundles from a shelf she had organized years earlier, confirmed the thickness with a hand gauge, and gave the exact quantity available before the caller could explain why he needed it. 3 days later another craftsman called from Louisiana looking for flexible black sections, suitable for restoring antique horse tack that no supplier had been able to match. The following week, a custom holster maker in Central Texas asked whether she had firm pieces with consistent grain, but irregular outlines that would never fit standard factory patterns. She answered yes before he finished describing them. Word traveled quietly because skilled craftsmen tend to remember people who solve problems that catalogs cannot. Nobody advertised her collection. Nobody placed billboards along the highway. One satisfied customer mentioned her name to another, who mentioned it to a repair specialist, who mentioned it to a saddle shop, and soon deliveries began moving away from the property instead of arriving there. The most surprising visitors were not the independent makers. They were purchasing managers from companies that had once considered those materials worthless. They walked through the buildings with puzzled expressions, reading handwritten labels, opening carefully stacked containers, measuring samples, and slowly realizing they were looking at an inventory system unlike anything inside their own warehouses. Every shelf reflected practical knowledge gathered over nearly a decade, instead of software-generated stock numbers. Ariel could identify a bundle by touch almost as quickly as by sight. She remembered where each shipment had originated, approximately when it had arrived, and which characteristics made it useful for a particular application. One manager quietly admitted that his company had spent years paying to remove the same categories, now becoming difficult to replace. Ariel simply smiled, because she had never been interested in proving anyone wrong. She had been preparing for a question the market had not yet learned to ask. Now that question was arriving from every direction, and each truck leaving her farm carried something much more valuable than carefully organized inventory. It carried proof that patient understanding often survives long after accepted assumptions begin to disappear. By the spring of 2008, the property outside Nacogdoches no longer resembled the quiet farm that local drivers had passed without notice for years. The old storage buildings remained where they had always been, but their purpose had changed completely. Shelves once filled according to Ariel's private system now supported a steady flow of outgoing orders prepared for craftsmen, restoration specialists, educational programs, and small manufacturers scattered across the United States. Every shipment followed the same disciplined routine. Each request was matched by grain pattern, finish, thickness, flexibility, and color before being measured, packaged, documented, and loaded for delivery. Customers did not purchase random assortments. They purchased confidence. They knew the material arriving at their workshop would solve the exact problem they had described. That reliability became the foundation of everything that followed. Repeat orders gradually replaced first-time buyers. Repair businesses recommended her inventory to neighboring shops. Leatherworking instructors began directing students toward Ariel, because they could obtain manageable quantities without committing to commercial-scale purchases. Small businesses appreciated being able to experiment with different textures before investing in larger production runs. Even companies that continued buying full hides from traditional suppliers occasionally contacted Ariel when unusual specifications appeared in custom projects. The operation expanded without abandoning the principles that had created it. She never rushed through inspections simply to increase volume. She never combined different grades inside the same shipment. She never allowed organization to become less important than growth. Those habits required more time, but they also eliminated uncertainty for customers whose own reputations depended upon consistent quality. Financial records reflected that trust with remarkable clarity. Revenue increased steadily rather than dramatically, quarter after quarter, instead of overnight. Additional storage buildings were renovated instead of replaced. Better packaging equipment appeared beside workbenches that had already served the family for decades. Local residents who had once assumed the farm contained little more than aging inventory began noticing delivery services arriving almost every afternoon. County business leaders quietly asked how a rural property had become a supplier to customers they had never heard of. Ariel answered those questions the same way she always had, with careful descriptions instead of grand claims. She explained what each customer needed, how every order differed, and why understanding the material mattered more than simply possessing it. By the end of that year, independent business valuations placed the operation at approximately $500,000. Not because forgotten pieces had somehow become extraordinary, but because years of patient knowledge had finally become impossible for the marketplace to overlook. Several years later, visitors driving the county roads outside Nacogdoches noticed something that could not be measured by inventory reports or financial statements alone. The buildings on Ariel Batista's property had become places where knowledge changed hands as often as materials did. Young leather workers arrived carrying notebooks instead of purchase orders. Small business owners came looking for advice before selecting a single piece for their next project. Restoration specialists walked through the aisles discussing grain direction, flexibility, and finishing techniques with the same patience Ariel's father had once shown her beside an old wooden workbench. She answered every question carefully, because she believed understanding should travel farther than any shipment ever could. The most remarkable change happened inside the industry itself. Companies that had once calculated disposal as an unavoidable operating expense gradually began re-examining how they sorted, documented, and distributed the materials they had previously overlooked. Some introduced secondary inventory programs. Others partnered with independent craftsmen instead of sending everything away. Training workshops began discussing smaller production markets that had received little attention before. None of those changes happened because someone invented a revolutionary material. They happened because one quiet example demonstrated that careful observation could reveal opportunities hidden inside ordinary routines. Ariel never described what she had accomplished as a business strategy. When reporters from regional trade publications occasionally asked how she had anticipated the market, she answered with the same simple explanation every time. She said that people often confuse usefulness with convenience. Factories must optimize for efficiency, because that is how factories survive. Craftsmen must optimize for precision, because that is how their work earns trust. Those are different questions, and different questions deserve different answers. Looking back, the most valuable thing stored on that East Texas farm had never been measured in pounds, square feet, or dollars. It was 9 years of patient attention applied to details that almost everyone else considered too ordinary to matter. The market eventually recognized the financial value of that work. But the money arrived long after the habit had already been formed. Every carefully labeled shelf, every handwritten note, every thoughtful decision had been made without any guarantee that the future would reward it. That is why this story is remembered today. It is not a story about becoming wealthy from overlooked materials. It is a story about seeing value before the rest of the world learns how to recognize it. Sometimes the greatest opportunity is not created by discovering something new. Sometimes it begins the moment one person decides to understand what everyone else has already stopped looking at.